A few years ago, my friends and I decided to take a weekend trip to a secluded cabin up in the mountains. It was one of those off-the-grid places with no cell service, no internet, and a whole lot of nothing around it. Just trees, trails, and a lake. It sounded like the perfect getaway to unwind and disconnect. The cabin we rented was part of a small cluster of old wooden cabins surrounding a lake, no more than 10 or 12 cabins in total. We got cabin 6, which was cozy, but a little run down. It was nothing special, just what we needed for a couple of days. When we arrived, we noticed that almost all of the other cabins were empty, except for one, cabin 9. There was a car parked outside, an older sedan that looked like it had been sitting there for a while. The curtains in the windows were drawn tight, and we didn't see anyone coming or going. I figured it was another couple staying there for the weekend, like us, just keeping to themselves. The first night was peaceful. We drank by the fire, played cards, and joked around. The isolation felt good, no distractions, just the sound of the wind through the trees and the crackling of the fire. We were all exhausted by the time we finally went to bed. The next morning, I noticed something odd when I stepped outside. The car outside cabin 9 hadn't moved. It wasn't unusual for people to leave their cars in one place for a weekend, but the cabin itself still looked just as closed up as it had when we arrived. No signs of life. I brought it up to my friend Jack while we were making breakfast. "You think the couple in cabin 9 is all right? Haven't seen them since we got here." Jack shrugged. "Maybe they're on a hike. People come here to get away, right?" I agreed, but the thought nagged at me. The whole time we'd been at the lake or hiking nearby, I hadn't seen anyone from cabin 9. Not a single light came on in the cabin that night either. Just complete darkness, like it had been abandoned. That night, things got weirder. It was late, probably around midnight, when we all decided to call it a night. As we were packing up from the fire pit, I noticed a light flickering on in cabin 9. It wasn't like someone had just turned on a lamp. It was erratic, flashing on and off quickly, as if someone was pacing back and forth in front of a lamp. I stood there staring for a moment, trying to make sense of it. "Hey, do you see that?" I asked, pointing toward the cabin. Jack turned to look, squinting. "That's weird. Maybe they're having some kind of electrical issue. Or maybe they're just playing with the lights," my friend Lena suggested with a shrug. "Who knows?" But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The flickering light kept going, like someone was signaling us. It went on for several minutes before suddenly stopping, plunging the cabin back into complete darkness. We headed inside, but I couldn't stop thinking about cabin 9. I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the scene over and over in my head. It didn't make sense. There was no movement, no shadows behind the curtains, just that eerie, flickering light. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps outside our cabin. At first I thought it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer wandering through the woods. But as I listened, the footsteps grew louder, heavier, and unmistakably human. They circled our cabin, slow and deliberate, like someone was walking around trying to see inside. My heart started pounding. I nudged Jack, who was snoring softly beside me. "Someone's outside," I whispered, barely able to keep my voice steady. He groggily sat up, listening. The footsteps stopped. We waited, holding our breath, but everything fell silent. Jack shrugged it off, telling me it was probably just someone from another cabin passing by. But I wasn't so sure. We hadn't seen anyone all weekend except for that flickering light in cabin 9. The next morning I decided to check out cabin 9 for myself. Jack wasn't thrilled about the idea, but I couldn't shake the unease I felt. We walked up to the cabin together, trying to make it look casual in case anyone was watching. The car was still there, parked in the exact same spot, collecting dirt and leaves. The windows were still covered, no sign of movement inside. I knocked on the door, no answer. Jack called out, "Hello? Anyone in there?" Nothing. The place was dead silent. After a few moments, I noticed something strange. The door wasn't fully closed. It was slightly ajar, barely hanging on its frame. My stomach dropped. "Do we go in?" I asked hesitantly. Jack shook his head. "No way, we should just tell someone." But curiosity got the better of me. I pushed the door open slowly, the rusty hinges creaking. The cabin smelled musty, like it hadn't been aired out in weeks. Inside, everything looked normal at first glance. A couple of suitcases, hiking gear, and food left out on the small kitchen table. But there was something about the place that felt wrong. It was like someone had just disappeared. There were 2 plates of half-eaten food on the table, as if whoever had been staying there had left in the middle of a meal. The bed was unmade and clothes were scattered across the floor. But the most unsettling part, the hiking boots were still by the door. No one leaves for a hike without their boots, especially out here. We backed out of the cabin, locking eyes with each other in silent agreement that something was very, very wrong. When we told the owner of the cabins, she seemed surprised but not particularly worried. She said the couple staying in cabin 9 had checked in almost a week before we arrived. She hadn't seen them since. They were probably just in a rush to leave, she said dismissively. Maybe they found another place to stay. But that didn't explain the car still sitting outside, or the fact that their clothes and belongings were still inside. Where would they go on foot in the middle of nowhere? The rest of the weekend was tense. We didn't talk about cabin 9 again, but every time I walked past it, I couldn't help but feel like something terrible had happened inside. We left the next morning. As we drove past cabin 9 for the last time, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had narrowly escaped something dark hidden behind those curtains. I still wonder what happened to the couple. I tried looking them up later, even searching online for any news about missing persons in that area, but there was nothing. It was like they had never existed. And every time I think about that flickering light, I get the same unsettling thought. Maybe they were trying to tell us something. Maybe they were warning us to leave. I haven't told many people about what happened last year, mostly because no one believes me. The police think it was just a case of someone leaving without a trace, but I know there's more to it than that. My best friend Kyle didn't just vanish, something took him. I can't prove it, but I know what I heard. I was the last person he spoke to. Kyle and I had been friends since middle school. We were the kind of friends who could go months without talking and pick up like no time had passed. But last year things were different. He'd started acting weird, like really weird. It started with little things, like him cancelling plans last minute or dodging my calls. At first I thought he was just going through a rough patch, but after a while I started to get worried. One night, after a few weeks of barely hearing from him, Kyle called me. It was around 11 p.m. and his voice sounded off. He was talking fast, breathing heavy like he'd been running or something. "Hey man, I need to tell you something," he stammered. "I've been seeing this thing. I don't know what it is, but it's been following me." I thought he was joking at first, maybe trying to mess with me. Kyle had always been a bit of a prankster, so I didn't take it seriously right away. "Dude, what are you talking about?" I asked, laughing nervously. "Are you drunk or something?" But he wasn't laughing. His voice was shaky and I could hear the fear in it. "I'm serious, man. It's been outside my window at night and I've seen it following me when I walk home. I don't know what it is, but it's..." He cut himself off and I could hear him breathing heavily on the other end of the line. "Have you told anyone else about this?" I asked, feeling a knot of anxiety form in my stomach. "No," Kyle whispered. "I didn't want anyone to think I was crazy, but I think it's getting closer." I tried to talk him down, telling him it was probably just his mind playing tricks on him or some stalker messing with him, but Kyle was convinced this wasn't human. He described it as a shadow, tall and thin, always standing just out of sight, always watching. "I need you to come over," he said suddenly. "I don't want to be alone tonight. Please." Something in his voice made me agree, even though part of me didn't want to. So I got in my car and started driving over to his apartment. It was a quiet drive, the streets mostly empty that late at night, but the closer I got to Kyle's place, the more my unease grew. When I arrived, the front of his apartment building was completely dark. No lights, no sounds, nothing. I parked on the street and texted Kyle, letting him know I was outside. No reply. I tried calling him, but the call went straight to voicemail. I figured maybe his phone had died or he'd fallen asleep, so I decided to go up and knock on his door. As I walked up the stairs to his apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The whole building felt off, too quiet, too still. When I reached his door, I knocked softly at first, then louder when there was no answer. "Kyle, it's me, man. Open up." Still nothing. I stood there for a few moments, unsure of what to do. I didn't want to barge in or make a scene, but something about the silence made my skin crawl. I knocked one more time, louder this time, hoping Kyle would come to the door. But instead of a reply, I heard something else. A faint scratching sound, like nails dragging across wood. It was coming from inside the apartment. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I pressed my ear to the door, trying to make out what the sound was. It was slow, deliberate, like someone, or something, was moving inside, scraping its fingers along the walls. I called Kyle's name again, but there was no response. Just the scratching, getting closer. I reached for the doorknob, and to my surprise, it was unlocked. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to leave, but I couldn't. I had to know what was happening. Slowly, I pushed the door open, the hinges creaking as it swung inward. The apartment was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamps outside. I stepped inside, my eyes scanning the room. Everything looked normal at first. Kyle's shoes by the door, his jacket hanging on the chair, the half-eaten pizza on the kitchen counter, but Kyle was nowhere to be found. And then I saw it. The window by the living room was open, curtains fluttering in the breeze. There were muddy footprints on the floor, leading from the window to the middle of the room. They weren't Kyle's. I followed the footprints with my eyes, my heart pounding in my ears. They stopped in the center of the room, right where Kyle's phone was lying on the floor. The screen cracked. I picked up the phone, my hands shaking. It was dead. But as I stood there, staring at the broken screen, I heard the scratching again, this time coming from the hallway behind me. I spun around, shining my phone's flashlight down the dark hallway. The scratching stopped. For a moment, everything was still, the silence pressing in on me like a weight. And then I heard it. A whisper, faint but unmistakable. It said my name. I didn't wait. I bolted out of the apartment, slamming the door behind me. I ran down the stairs, my heart pounding, and didn't stop until I was back in my car, locking the doors. I tried calling Kyle again, but the phone went straight to voicemail. I never saw Kyle after that night. The police said there was no sign of foul play, just an open window and some strange footprints. They assumed he'd taken off, maybe decided to leave town without telling anyone. But I know that's not what happened. I know something took him. And sometimes late at night, I still hear his voice in my head, calling my name, just like it did that night in the apartment. And every time, I wonder if it's really him or if it's the thing that followed him. I've always lived in small towns. There's something comforting about them, the quiet streets, the sense of familiarity, the neighbors who wave every time you drive by. But small towns can also have secrets, dark, unsettling secrets that no one likes to talk about. There's a house a few streets over from mine that's been empty for as long as I can remember. Growing up, we used to call it the Wilkins house, named after the family that used to live there. They moved in about 10 years ago from somewhere out of state. No one really knew much about them, but they seemed nice enough. It was a young couple, Eric and Melissa. and their 2 kids, a boy and a girl. I remember seeing them at the grocery store a few times, but they mostly kept to themselves. For a while, everything seemed normal. The kids played in the yard, the parents would wave politely to passers-by, and there was nothing out of the ordinary. But then one day they just disappeared. It happened overnight. One morning their car was gone, the house was locked up tight, and no one ever saw them again. At first, people assumed they had moved suddenly, maybe for a new job or to be closer to family. But as weeks turned into months, the house remained empty, untouched, and everyone started to get uneasy. No moving trucks ever came. The lawn grew wild, and no one heard from the Wilkins family again. The town eventually stopped talking about it. The house became just another piece of local lore, the kind of place teenagers would dare each other to visit on Halloween. I didn't think much of it until last summer when I decided to buy my first home. I've always been a bit of a bargain hunter, so when I saw that the Wilkins house was up for sale at a dirt cheap price, I couldn't resist. I figured it was just one of those properties that had been left empty for too long, and the bank was eager to sell it. I didn't believe in the town gossip or the whispers about what had happened to the family. Looking back, I wish I had listened. I went to the open house on a Saturday morning. The real estate agent, Linda, was pleasant enough, but she seemed on edge, like she couldn't get out of the house fast enough. She rushed me through the tour, pointing out the basics, the number of rooms, the age of the kitchen appliances, the roof condition, without much enthusiasm. I thought she was just bored with her job. I had no idea what was really going on. The house looked like it had been frozen in time. There were still family photos on the walls, toys scattered in the kids' rooms, and dishes left in the sink as if the Wilkins had meant to come back any moment. It was unsettling, but I figured it was just because the bank had never cleared the place out. The more I walked through it, the more I felt like I was intruding. As I reached the second floor, I noticed something odd. The master bedroom door was closed, unlike all the other rooms which were wide open. The rest of the house had felt abandoned, but this door seemed deliberate, as if someone had closed it on purpose. I hesitated for a moment before opening it. The room was empty, except for the bed, which was still made. But there was something else. On the nightstand, there was an old, outdated flip phone. It didn't look like the kind of thing anyone would still be using. Curious, I picked it up, pressing a few buttons to see if it worked. To my surprise, the phone lit up. There were no texts, no calls in the log, except for one voicemail. It had been left exactly a year after the family had disappeared. My heart started pounding as I stared at the screen. I don't know why I did it, but I pressed play. The voicemail was short, but it chilled me to my core. It was Eric's voice, strained and frantic. All he said was, "We're not safe here. It's inside the house. Don't come back." And then the line went dead. I dropped the phone, my hands shaking. I tried to rationalize what I had just heard. Maybe it was some kind of prank, a joke someone had left behind. But the fear in Eric's voice, there was no mistaking it. He was terrified, and whatever he had been afraid of was inside the house. I left the house that day, deciding I wanted nothing to do with it. I told Linda I wasn't interested, but I didn't mention the voicemail. I didn't want her to think I was crazy. But I couldn't get the Wilkins family out of my head. Over the next few days, I found myself obsessing over their disappearance, scouring old town records, talking to people who had lived nearby at the time. The more I dug, the more unsettling details I uncovered. It turned out that Eric had been seen around town in the weeks leading up to their disappearance, acting strange, nervous, jumpy, like he was constantly looking over his shoulder. People said he'd started locking all the windows and doors even during the day, and he'd become increasingly paranoid about someone or something trying to get into the house. No one could say what had happened on the night the family vanished, but one neighbor, an older woman who lived 2 houses down, told me something that still gives me chills. She said that on the last night she saw the Wilkins family, she had heard a strange noise coming from their house. It was late, past midnight, and she had been getting ready for bed when she heard what sounded like someone knocking on her window. When she looked outside, she saw nothing, just the dark street. But when she turned toward the Wilkins house, she saw it. A figure, tall, thin and shadowy, standing in the front yard, just staring at the house. She said it didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was just watching. She called the police, but by the time they arrived, the figure was gone. And so was the Wilkins family. I haven't gone back to that house since. I don't know what happened to the Wilkins family, or what Eric meant in that voicemail. But I do know one thing. They didn't just leave. Something took them. And sometimes, when I pass by that house at night, I swear I can see someone, or something, standing in the shadows, watching, waiting for the next family to move in.